speakers in the order of appearance. Tonya Novitz from University of Bristol will start the afternoon. Then Elizabeth Ramshuber from University of Vienna, from the just around the corner. And old friends from Digilare project. Digilare project is not been represented here. It's about collective rights and digitalization. And then Jose Maria is coming third from Santiago de Compostela. And then Silvia Raiola will close the session, who is from ETUI. And she's coming soon. So I hope that she arrived by the time.
2 minutes.
Always Elizabeth is the boss, so I have to
very
just
proud that once you are on
and you are very you're very proud of being president. Take it easy. So we have to wait a little bit.
Bueno, pues a Skype había bastante gente. Por la tarde.
Ya hasta las 7.
Silvia, please come here.
I don't feel very well, so I want to take some air because yes, thank you.
Okay, Tonya, I think we can start. The floor is yours.
Great.
You can speak from here or anywhere you like.
Great, I will speak from here then. Thank you very much. So I'd like to begin by thanking our hosts, Professors Daniel Perez del Ferraro and Tomas Rivera, and all those who have made this excellent conference possible. I'm going to be speaking on the right to strike, and in preparing this presentation, I came across this impressive example of street art from Hong Kong, photographed in 2018, saying that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it's obviously a statement of Martin Luther King, written in 1963. But what it reminded me of was the statements in the ILO Constitution. The idea that the failure of any nation to adopt humane conditions of labour then is an obstacle in the way of other countries doing so. And there's that lovely piece in the Declaration of Philadelphia saying that poverty anywhere constitutes a danger to prosperity everywhere. So, lots of echoes there. So this is going to be a presentation which understands the conditions of labour in the digital economy and justice for those whose work as essentially transnational. So I think a live issue is whether we want or need to reassert protection of a right to strike at national, regional and international levels, and whether by doing so we should be redesigning those labour standards along the way. And I suppose what we see immediately is a current lack of attention to right to strike in national labour law, at EU level, and even most recently at the International Labour Organization. So when I'm thinking about this in relation to regulation of digital work, I've had to do some what we might call blue sky thinking. So that means that I'm very open to discussion with you in the session and afterwards to hear whether what I'm saying makes any sort of sense to you or whether it needs further thinking and refinement. So let's think briefly about the context and the issues. One part of the context for this presentation is the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, on protection of the right to strike under International Labour Organization ILO Convention number 87. And you'll know that that was issued very recently on the 21st of May. Now, the advisory opinion states that strike action is one of the main activities engaged in and tools used by workers and their organizations to promote their interests and improve conditions of labour, thereby ensuring the effective exercise of freedom of association. So it does seem strange that if we are trying to promote collective bargaining, if we're trying to promote freedom of association in a digitized workplace, that we're not thinking at all about the right to strike and issues of conflict. Now, the question before the court was very narrowly focused, and the advisory opinion by a majority of 10 to 4 still does not entail any determination on the precise content, scope, or conditions for the exercise of the right. But what I'm suggesting is that we really ought to now be thinking about this at the ILO, in human rights litigation, in regional and national policy making, to ensure that the right to strike is actually useful and relevant. And in this context, we might want to take note of the advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which has done exactly this in relation to platform work and the right to strike connected to platform work, saying that one of the things that needs to be done is that member states need to make the right to strike more relevant, and that includes providing access to the right to strike to those in the platform work sector, even if they're not formally speaking employees. So we've got that kind of guidance, and there's a brilliant piece in the most recent UK Industrial Law Journal 2026 by Ricardo Buendia Esteban, which looks at that in some detail. Now, I've heard recently Marco Piazzi talk about platform work as, if you like, the laboratory for the study of the application of labour law and collective action in the context of algorithmic management and AI. And I think that's a nice way to think about this. As we've heard this morning, our experience of platform work demonstrates that increasing automated surveillance and algorithmic management can impede the formation of communities at work. It has a detrimental impact on labour standards, and also seems to prevent the kinds of combined action that enable collective bargaining and political resistance. So there's been extensive studies of this, Bush and Rogers in the US, Ruth Dukes and Wolfgang Streeck. But as a result, we might expect a kind of passivity in this laboratory of platform work, but what we've found is actually the opposite. So we've seen quite a lot of interesting, creative industrial action. For example, in Uber, in food delivery. And what I think this demonstrates is that regardless of the issue of surplus labour, workers are still prepared to take collective action to defend their interests. And more than that, their combined action has actually prompted forms of legislative change. So we have seen responses in the platform work sector, and I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen this kind of activist work by independent unions in that context. So we might also want to ask the question, is the digital element of work now enabling? Does it do something to counteract the bargaining power that we're seeing of employers in the sector? It is possible that there are new forms of global organisation and resistance that are possible through digital means that weren't happening earlier. So there was the virtual general strike, which was the spin-off for the Friday protests for climate change, that then had to go online in the context of the pandemic and was highly effective in terms of continuing visibility for the climate change movement. We also saw a world digital strike organised by the Imagine project on the 24th of February of this year, rather less successful, but they're planning another one. And we've also seen that those workers who are engaged in the tech industry, in the so-called production of AI, are now getting increasing bargaining leverage. So strike action was taken by 45,000 workers at Samsung on the 21st of May of this year. And Fortune magazine responded with this kind of sensationalist article saying this labour strike at Samsung's memory chip plants could throw a wrench into the AI boom as if one single strike would do that. But it's very interesting that there's this response. So in a comparable way, Germany's self-described leading specialist firm for employment law, Klimt HR Lawyers, expressed concern that digital strikes could unduly boost workers' bargaining power and interfere with employers' rights. And they commented that when digitalization meets a largely unregulated right to strike, the result is legal uncertainty, at least for now. So, on the one hand, we have workers and their representatives wanting greater clarity on the right to strike, needing to compensate for employers' enhanced bargaining power around algorithmic management and AI. And on the other, we have employer representatives who seem to find that increasingly threatening and who would like to act and legislate to potentially use existing labour law to constrain digital strikes and also to engage in forms of legal reform. So the two are taking place simultaneously. And what do we know so far about legal regulation of algorithmic management or AI? So there's not much in the way of express recognition of the need for protection of a right to strike in the emergent EU legal instruments. There's no express mention of strikes, digital or otherwise, in the GDPR. There are, of course, as you know, the limitations on processing of personal data, such as trade union membership in Regulation 9, Article 9, and Article 88, as Professor Perez de Prado said this morning, provides more generally for the capacity of member state laws and collective agreements to ensure the protection of rights and freedoms in the processing of personal data in an employment context. I hope we can assume that the right of freedom to strike is one of those rights and freedoms in Article 88. But I think it's important to realise it's not a requirement to regulate in this respect. The provision only gives permission to do so. In the Platform Work Directive, there is, of course, express reference to collective bargaining in the recitals in relation to processing of personal data, and also, of course, Article 25 providing more generally for promotion of collective bargaining and platform work, which I think, following the ICJ advisory opinion, it's very hard to imagine Article 25 being effective without recourse to a right to strike. But it's not explicit. And in relation to AI risks anticipated by the Artificial Intelligence Act, Recital 9 does say that the regulation will not affect the exercise of fundamental rights, including the right or freedom to strike. But that's the only context in which strikes are mentioned. So the AI Act does not regulate strikes, but envisages that the right to strike is one of those fundamental freedoms with which the AI Act must be compatible. So Article 5 on prohibited AI practices makes provision for appropriate safeguards for the fundamental rights and freedoms of natural persons. I think following Recital 9, we have to really think of that as including a right to strike. And again, in Article 59, this need for effective monitoring mechanisms to identify if there are any high risks to the rights and freedoms of the data subjects, workers. So there's probably enough here to provide some basis for thinking creatively about protection of the right to strike, but not much. It's not a very firm foundation. Perhaps more interesting is ILO Convention number 193, which, as was discussed earlier, has just been adopted in the last few days. Again, the right to strike isn't mentioned at all in the convention, but its protection could be implicit in the protection of freedom of association under Article 3. And I think it's quite hard to imagine, following the advisory opinion, that the constituents of the International Labour Conference really didn't think that a right to strike would be included in Article There is also a key health and safety provision, which I think has implications for collective action. So Article 5 provides that familiar possibility that where there is an imminent and serious danger to life or health, that digital platform workers, and they don't need to have employment status for this, have the right to remove themselves. Now obviously we've seen a version of that under Article 8 of the Health and Safety Framework Directive in the EU, and that's been transposed into national law in many countries. It's not usually seen as a species of strike action, but in some of the research that I did with Peter Anderson in Sweden during the pandemic, we looked at the exercise of this entitlement by Swedish trade union representatives and found that there was collective action taking place to protect personal or protected equipment in the workplace. So that is potentially relevant. And then we have Articles 14 and 16. Article 14 talks about the importance of taking appropriate measures to ensure responsible use of automated systems to respect, promote, and realise the fundamental principles and rights at work, which must refer to Article 3, which I'm arguing must include a right to strike, and also Article 16, which talks about effective and appropriate safeguards regarding personal data. So these provisions could affect the forms of surveillance which are deemed appropriate, and blacklisting that can happen through algorithmic management where people take strike action, withdraw their labour, and it could also have implications for blacklisting of strikers. And this brings me, I think, to my last slide. It's going to continue for longer, but I think otherwise I'll run out of time. So I just wanted to identify some silences on key questions relating to the scope and content of the right to strike, which I've unpacked in a longer paper, which I'm just going to go through very briefly with you here. So I think we have to think a little bit more carefully about how a right to strike translates into the digital workplace. And there are so many subsidiary questions here. So the first really, which is quite fundamental, is what is labour in this context and what constitutes its withdrawal? So if we think about this, do we regard this as labour, any form of digital engagement with, for example, an app, which creates forms of data that can then be used in productive ways? Has been argued that this should be regarded as labour and that we might regard a virtual general strike as coordinated digital non-participation. So this is a possibility. Or do we think that casualised but paid labour, so gig-based platform work, should be included? And if it is, then to what extent can employers rely on labour legislation to constrain strikes, to pursue injunctive orders to stop strikes? To what extent are we going to use contractual norms? And when we have platform workers who withdraw their labour through not logging onto the platform, rather than failing to take tasks when logged in, to what extent do we regard this as industrial action? And then we have this problem about remote digital work where there's a degree of skill and discretion. To what extent could that be a withdrawal of labour? Then we can think about what are the acceptable aims and objectives of a strike in the contemporary digital workplace. Should they be more extensive, given that there's more capacity for inequality of bargaining power? So for example, should you be able to take action against a third party that is refusing to change the features of an algorithm or a black box in order to prevent forms of discrimination or which affect profoundly standards of work? How are we going to organise balloting for strike action and what forms of notice would be appropriate? So that's currently a live issue in the UK where we're pursuing plans for introduction of electronic balloting. There's an interesting question as to whether digital services come to be seen as essential. So for example, is the kind of human oversight of AI services going to be seen as somehow essential if those AI services could affect the life, personal safety or health of the whole part of the population? So to what extent do we respond to that? We might want to also think about the consequences of strikes which are acceptable. Is disconnection appropriate versus detriment and dismissal previously? Article 17 of Convention 193 talks about a state being able to take appropriate measures to prohibit the suspension or deactivation of a digital platform worker's account, so as well as termination of their employment. So it'll be interesting to see how that's used and applied. And then we have this ongoing issue about surveillance and blacklisting for strikes and the measures which are there under the GDPR, Platform Work Directive and the AI Act, as well as now Article 16 of the ILO Convention. And finally, could we think about preventing replacement labour during strikes by AI as a temporary measure? So there's so much to kind of unpack here, and I just wanted to highlight that for you. So I think I spoke too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. And I propose to listen to one of the speakers, and then we'll have hopefully something like 20 minutes for questions and discussion. I think we're ready. Just for 10 seconds. And Elizabeth, the floor is yours. You have such a beautiful university building. I love it.
Thank you so much. First of all, thanks so much to Danielle and Damash for the kind invitation to today's conference. But not only thanks to you, but also to the Digilare project, which was also already mentioned during the very kind introduction. So basically, what I'm presenting today is one of the outcomes of this project that we, together, a group of researchers from 15 countries, conducted for the past 2 years, but not only we as researchers under the magnificent lead of Jose Maria Miranda, but also together with social partners. One of them, for example, Fernando, is here. So perhaps you're going to see some of your input reflected in today's presentation. Why am I telling this to you? Because what we've seen is that when we co-create knowledge together, academics with social partners, hopefully also results that might somehow in the future then also be useful in practice can be created. That was the one prelim, and the second is I wanted to start my presentation with a quote, namely the one determining the applicable collective labor law, and in particular in relation to employee representation, is one of the most delicate and difficult matters of international labor law. So determining the applicable law. So from which period, from which year does that quote state in your view? I know it's after lunch, so from which year does that quote? That it's really difficult to determine the applicable labor law as regards collective labor law issues, employee representation. From which period? From which year does it date?
1985?
1982, too early, kind of too late.
1959.
Yeah, he knows it all. So it dates from 1959. So that quote it's nearly 70 years old, from a German legal scholar Franz Gamlischek. And the question is now, does it remain true today? And what I would like to show you in the upcoming 20 minutes is yes, it remains as true today as it was back then in 1959. Just remember, only in 2023, about 44 million workers within the European Union were teleworking. So we're working from home at one point or another, and surely many of them were working transnationally. And I would like to highlight that by showing you 3 examples. The one, and all 3 of them, more or less also reflected in the judgments by the Austrian Supreme Court of Justice. One dates already back to 1997. So imagine there's a company with headquarters, so physical work site in Austria. And there's 4 sales representatives not working in Austria, but in Germany, France, Sweden, and beautiful Spain. They have no workplace in Vienna. That was a real case. No workplace in Vienna. They work as sales representatives and then dealing with companies, etc., in several other countries. So what was the question here? Back then, already in 1997. So they had regular contact with the head of the company in Vienna, and there was this physical company in Vienna. And now imagine, so that I added because of today's conference, right? Imagine now that the company, the headquarters in Vienna, wants to introduce an AI management tool, which in our view requires information consultation procedures to be started. We heard it today from Danielle, Article 26.7 of the AI Act, but also Article 4, Paragraph 2C of the Information Consultation Framework Directive 2014. But the Works Council, if one exists in Vienna. Does the Viennese Works Council represent the employees, the sales representatives in Germany, France, Sweden, and Spain? What about if there's a redundancy plan, matter of co-determination? So not only information and consultation, but co-determination, which goes beyond that. Shall be concluded, are those employees covered? But that question, the particular question, was not addressed by the Austrian Supreme Court of Justice back then in 1997, but it stated already back then, well, that communication possibilities back then in 1997 enabled those sales representatives to work together within one representative unit situated in Austria. So those sales representatives who never ever set the foot to Austrian soil, apart from Christmas celebrations, right, belonged to the Austrian establishment, were covered by workplace representation rules there, irrespective of the law governing their employment contract, irrespective of law governing their tax or social security regimes. Second example, also inspired by case law of the Austrian Supreme Court of Justice. Now it gets a little more difficult. So imagine there's a company in the chemical industry with several production units in Germany, also physical production sites in Germany, but no physical production site in Austria. But in Austria, there work 4 employees who form part of the CEE sales team. They form part of a team consisting of 12 employees. The other 4 employees sit and work, telework, all of them from home, none of them present at any physical work site, but work together digitally in the CEE sales team. And there's a head of the CEE sales team based in Vienna, but this head of unit also reports to the manager in Munich. Again, the question here is, the headquarters in Germany would like to introduce an AI management tool. Which rules regarding information and consultation apply? Austrian rules? Because perhaps there's an establishment in Austria. Is there an establishment according to Austrian national rules? Does it exist? Well, we can be quite sure that an establishment under German Betriebsverfassungsgesetz exists in Germany, but do these employees here, the Austrian ones, the ones in Czech Republic, Hungary, etc., do they belong to that German establishment? No, because in Germany there's this Zwei-Komponenten-Lehre, and unless they have an employment contract with the German company, they do not belong to the establishment. Therefore, workplace representation rules do not apply. Last but not least, I'm sorry, it's the most complex example, but it exists in practice. Matrix organizations, but transnationally organized. What does it mean? Well, organizations, kind of management models, which are not linked anymore to the juridical person, to the company. So they are not connected to the company structure itself. So imagine now there's a matrix organization with employees belonging to each of these kind of heads of units situated in Austria, but working sometimes together, sometimes not in different countries. Again, an AI management tool is introduced. Which rules regarding information consultation apply? What is the connecting factor? Is it the establishment according to the law and practice in some member states? Is it the employment contract? Under Austrian law, most probably not. Information consultation rules do not apply. Why not? Because there's no uniform management for a certain amount of employees in Austria. Is the undertaking the establishment? Well, if the undertaking with headquarters in Austria is the establishment, well, do all employees who sit and work in different member states, can they be kind of counted in? Are the thresholds then fulfilled? Yes or not? And then there comes the beautiful French example. Well, what if some of those employees sit and work in France and decide that they form a so-called unité économique et sociale in France? What if those employees decide, well, they're a communauté de travail, and they have that decided by a court? Then French employee representation rules need to be applied. Why am I showing you all these real-world examples? Because I think the key question here is, we're talking about this very theoretical framework, what needs to be done for kind of information consultation rules. Well, I think the real problem is, why should we care? Well, it's a fundamental right, right? The right to information consultation according to Article 27 of the Charter. When introducing AI and algorithmic management systems, if we take these fundamental rights or this fundamental right for real, I think we should also guarantee, or the EU legislature should guarantee, that it could actually be exercised by employees and their representatives. Also, we learn democracy at the workplace. There is findings on that, and currently more and more people are working on that. Of course, not the lawyers, but the social scientists working on that, that apparently we learn democracy at the workplace. And in times like these, I think it is essential. And of course, we all know that also information and consultation carried out in the spirit of loyal cooperation could also provide competitive advantages for companies. What is clear, however, and that's why we dealt with this question within our project, is that there is no conflict rules for these issues. So it's quite difficult for companies as well as for employees and their representatives to assess which law is the applicable one. What is clear, or what is relatively clear, is that the Rome I regulation does not apply because Articles 8 and 9 deal with individual employment contracts. So we cannot fall back on these rules. What is also relatively clear is that the more or less purely national approaches in place, regulating the collective dimension of the employment relationship, are in line with existing EU law. There is some authors challenging that, but let's take that from this point. We don't go into detail here. So we believe, and that's what is one of the main results of our project, of the Digilada project, that there's a need for European coordination on this very point. So in the remaining minutes, after the introduction, which we've already ticked, right, I would like to focus on two essential questions, namely this conflict of laws conundrum at the transnational digital workplace, and potential legal solutions with the question from territoriality towards the 28th legal regime question mark. What we're not going to deal with is the potential issue of transnational company agreements. Spoiler, we're at the moment, Jose Maria and I, together with a wonderful team, collecting the last pieces for an edited book on these issues, and the chapter by Pierre Eloy is going to be on this issue on transnational company agreements, if you're interested in that. What we're focusing today is this potential need for a 28th connecting factor or a conflict of laws framework. So let's focus on this conflict of laws conundrum at the transnational digital workplace. I think that our examples revealed that already under national law, under Austrian law, or under German law, under French law, it is quite difficult to assess whether national rules apply, simply because the rules in place were not and are not devised for the digital transnational workplace. So most of the rules in place do not deal with these transnational digital issues. So what do we do as lawyers? We interpret existing norms, which leads to huge legal uncertainty. So now imagine you're a company or you're workers' representatives. trying to deal with that. Of course, we could try to recourse to European Works Council directive, but we all know that it's only designed for large companies, that it has limited material scope. But, and that's one of the advantages, it favors a negotiated solution, right? We'll come back to that later. It's also clear that not only can we not find easy solutions, de lege lata, so interpreting the existing laws, but unfortunately also the social partners, at least up until now, could not come to a good solution. There is this still rather outdated old social partner framework agreement on telework dating from 2002, where the assessment of this framework agreement states, well, more research is required on transnational aspects of telework. Well, thank you. We tried to do that within our project. Unfortunately, no new agreement could be found in November 2023. We all know that. What did we do in the project then? So what was our first step? We thought, well, we'll try to look for the existing connecting factors, to be able to draw this picture, to have in mind what are the connecting factors for employee representation according to national law. Of course, knowing very well, like we all do, that there's also this single channel, dual channel difference in the member states, which complicates the issue even further, yeah? We leave that aside for now. What are the connecting factors for information consultation under national law and practice? Well, unfortunately, it's not only the establishment under national law and practice. That is one connecting factor in many member states, not only Austria and Germany, but also to some extent the Netherlands, Estonia, Turkey, France, and Spain, with some additional rules then. But in other member states, it's the employment contract that is the connecting factor. For example, in Ireland, Poland, Romania, trade union membership, of course, in the single channel member states, so Sweden to some extent, also Ireland. It might also be the habitual place of work, like in Hungary. And then there's some additional rules in place. Like, for example, in France, it could also be this communauté de travail, this collectivity of interests of employees being the connecting factor for national information and consultation rules to be applied. So we see the picture is quite diverse. In addition, and the question is, or the second question, the second step is, well, who is actually bound by those rules? What's the personal and material scope of the rules? Is there a conflict rule? Because as I've showed before, there's no conflict rule at supranational level. Rome 1 regulation does not apply. So what do national laws state about who is to be covered by the national rules? And most jurisdictions have in place, to one extent or another, this principle of territoriality as a conflict rule, stating, very superficial level, right? I'm now making it easier, trying to make it easier, that only those circumstances, right, establishment or person working there, only those circumstances taking place within the territory of the state are to be covered. Coming back to our initial example, well, in some cases, then some jurisdictions extend this principle to some situations outside of their territory, like in the first example with the sales representatives in 1997. They were not present in Austria, right? Except for the Christmas party. Still, they were covered by Austrian representation rules because they were said to belong to the Austrian establishment. So there's an extension of the rules. Still, lacuna exists as regards information and consultation coverage, as I've tried to show you in the second example, with the company headquarters in Germany, employees working in Austria and several other member states. Well, if the establishment is in Germany under German collective representation rules, those employees are not covered, right? And we think that this is a legal lacuna that should be remedied. How to remedy? Well, I'm skipping that part. I think territoriality is in conformity with the EU law, right? what are the potential legal solutions to that? Well, one solution, of course, but this would be a purely national one, could be to codify national private international law, as was tried to carry out by a French projet de codification du droit international privé in 2022, which never saw the light of day, but at least it was this project. There's a quote in the slides, which I'm happy to share with you afterwards. So in France, they tried to codify at least the existing rules in order to create legal certainty, because there's a lack of a coordination at EU level. Other potential solutions could be an autonomous interpretation of central legal terms, but there's still this problem of the different connecting factors of this huge diversity in member states. So we also think that this wouldn't really serve our purpose. Well, what about like creating a 28th connecting factor? Well, that sounds quite nice, doesn't it, right? And it goes along, it follows with what is, to be said, quite sexy, right, at the moment. So there's also already some 20 years ago in Social Security, right, there was this idea of a 13th state model revisited. Now revisited for the 27 member states, I'm sorry, by Peters and Skalkins, but it also exists now, this kind of idea of a 28th legal regime. Those of you who are familiar with this EU Inc. proposal, in company law, this idea also revisited of a 28th legal company regime. So this is nothing new. And this EU Inc. proposal, this company model, this 28th, is supposed to enhance efficient, competitive company structures. Yet, in my view, I think it's a lost opportunity to address employee representation in a broader sense, because what does it deal with? It deals only with employee participation in board level structures, tries actually to make lives for companies easier, but it forgets what we are talking about. We're talking about employee representation, so information and consultation rights. So imagine now, you want to establish this fabulous EU Inc. You think, well, I'm fine with dealing with those employee participation structures in the member state where I register my office, because that is, if it is going to see the light of day, that is going to be the rule, right? So employee participation in the member state where the registered office is. But imagine now that you have employees in several other member states, and that under the national rules, territoriality, employee representation rules, that under those rules of the other member states, according to the connecting factors in place, you still have to establish 10 different employee representative bodies. What does it serve then? I think it's a lost opportunity. So we came up within the project with the idea of a more comprehensive approach for digital cross-border situations, in our view facilitating the internal market, because that is what it is about. What did we aim at? We aimed at simplifying the application of employee representation mechanisms. By doing so, reducing the administrative burden on employers, and at the same time, of course, guaranteeing fundamental rights for employees. So the goal is to establish a conflict of laws framework to determine which member states' rules on employee representation apply in a digital cross-border situation. We believe that the correct legal basis for that would be Article 81 TFEU, but of course this could be challenged. What are our two key rules that I'm quickly going through? These are the last two slides. As I've said, happy to share and then happy to discuss later on. We think that, of course, it's not a finished kind of elaboration of a whole regulation, but we believe that two rules are essential. First, as a general rule or as a basic rule, setting up rules where employee representation should take place. So have a conflict of law rules, and you need one kind of connecting factor. And it would be easy, of course, also thinking about the terms that we're familiar with in the European Works Council Directive, like for example, central management, to have the law of the member states as kind of the rule in place where central management is situated. Of course, this might lead to evasion practices by companies, so therefore to prevent forum shopping, but also to reflect the genuine communities of interest, and also to reflect what we know from conflict of law rules. Remember Article 3 and Article 8 of Rome 1 regulation, which allows for the choice of law. We also establish a second rule, which is quite complicated, but kind of the essence is that if employees of this digital company who work together digitally, if they democratically organized decide that they want the rules of another member state and not the one where central management is situated to be applied, then it's the rules of the other member state. For all employees. So that's why it's not a simple conflict of law rule, but more or less a conflict of laws framework, kind of heading into the direction of a 28th legal regime. I conclude. I think it is essential that at least we think about these questions. Why? Because we know that since the Treaty of Lisbon, but the court stated so also before, like for example in the Aged Herakles case, the union is not only an economic union, but we aim at a highly competitive social market union, aiming at full employment and social progress. And if we listen to President von der Leyen carefully in her speech where she addressed Parliament before then becoming head of the Commission a second time, she stated, well, la démocratie européenne doit être plus participative. I think we should take that seriously and start working on that at the employee representative level. It's also enshrined in the European Social Pillar Action Plan, and if you want to read more about that, read my chapter in the book.
My wife keeps telling me that I'm not strict enough with the kids. So she might be right, but I'm not strict enough with the speakers. I hope you agree with me that I had to leave Elizabeth to go through because all the planned slides show, because it was really interesting. So we started with Tonya on right to strike. We continued with information consultation rights. So if we have the title for Elizabeth, like everything about information consultation, then Jose Maria will continue with everything else on information and information consultation. Then we move and finish off with collective bargaining. If you speak as much as she did, nobody will have questions. No time, which is very nice not to have questions, but it's even better to have. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and first of all, thank you to my dear colleagues for the invitation to this conference. And also congratulations because of the huge number of remarkable speakers and presenters of papers that have gathered here. I'm absolutely jealous. And I'm also furious because they have given me the worst time after two brilliant presentations and at siesta time. We should be sleeping and not listening. Two things like that. That's my turn to ruin everything. Emperor Charles V was also king of Spain, had a brilliant quote. I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to me. Oh, sorry, I forgot that, yeah.
It's siesta time.
I speak Spanish to God, French, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse. Is that not talking about digitalization? So I'm going to speak English. Following his, for example, first a disclaimer, I'm not going to quote Tolkien. Sorry, everybody was expecting that, but I'm going to make another author's present. Mainly, I'm going to present you with the main contents of the policy paper of the so much quoted Pillar project, where we studied information and consultation rights in the digital era in 15 member states and also in Turkey. If anyone is interested, we have published the policy paper in 12 languages, so you can have it translated in order to make it easier the dissemination. 100 years ago, the last opera, we can debate this, has its premiere Turandot on the 25th April 1926 in La Scala di Milano. In one extraordinary moment in the second act, the soprano sings three other riddles, death is one. But then the tenor challenges her, and you see it in the score how all the flats become sharps, and he sings one tone louder. The riddles are 3, but they are live. And that's my point of view about digitalization. Digitalization can be a risk, but can be an advantage. That's how we do deal with it. So my main point, and that's my starting phrase, we need to regulate digitalization. That's my trench. I'm ready to die defending that position. Who must regulate? I think the European Union, because I think the member states are too small to deal with the risks of a global digitalization. So we need a huge actor, and in spite of the beautiful ILO convention, I think that we need something more pragmatic, such a European Union legislation. 3 riddles in Turandot, 3 challenges in my presentation that are very close to those presented this morning brilliantly by Thomas Julavary, because at the end we are all thinking from different countries about the same problems. So I'm going to give you just some hints about the personal scope of information and consultation rights, the use of digital tools by worker representatives, and finally some ideas about digital contents and IC rights. Many of my ideas have already been said during the previous interventions, so I can jump over that and go into there. Let's start with the personal scope. 1 kilometer in that direction, you can find the Museo del Prado, the best pictures gallery in the world. And there we have Velázquez, the Forge of Vulcan. Are they gods? Are they men? Are all of them working together, whatever their legal status? And that's the situation that we find nowadays that's enhanced by digitalization. We have employees in the labor law meaning of the word, but also independent workers who perform the same activities under the same direction. In platforms, out of platforms, wherever it is. In the current way of production, the legal status of the person performing the activity is becoming irrelevant. And that's why in the Digilar project, we make our bet in order to create new rules that cover in the field of information and consultation rights, both employees and both independent workers. Here we have Apple and Vulcan and the 3 aids of the God. We are not creating in reality anything, because this is the approach of the directive on platform work. And it's also in a serious thing, like the guidelines on collective bargaining issued by the European Commission, where they describe very clearly how collective bargaining agreements could cover regular employees and people working side by side, I'm quoting the guidelines, with them. So if mixed collective bargaining, if mixed data protection for platforms are already in the horizon of the European Union legislation, we believe that information and consultation rights can also appear in that horizon. Łukasz Pisarczyk has contributed with an excellent chapter in our incoming book about these possibilities. And our main suggestion, going to the Court of Justice in France, is using the criterion of the decisive influence. Our proposal is to modify the framework directive on information and consultation rights, just to incorporate all those people working in that situation to the rules of the information and consultation directive. So we should take into account all these people in order to calculate thresholds, in order to give rights, in order to give and receive information about that. It's not so difficult, and it's possible in the actual European Union framework. Our proposal is to use Article 115 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the same one, it was number 100, that was used to create the first directive on information and consultation rights, the directive of collective redundancies. If they could do that in 1975, they can use that in 2027 in order to create this mixed structure of representation. So first riddle, who? First riddle in Turandot is how. Here our answer is everybody. Everybody working together should be the subject of information and consultation rights. Our second question is where, has been brilliantly dealt with by Elizabeth Abeshuga, so I'm not going to extend myself on that, but I'm going into the who. Sorry, the how. Not Doctor Who, that's now suspended, but how. Information now is digital and all should recognize that piece of information in my screen. Many buttons died to bring us that information. Paper is being abandoned. We have emails, we have PDFs, we have intranets, we have Zoom and Teams meetings. In some countries, we have digital elections to select workers' representatives. It is time to take some decisions, some legally binding decisions on this thing. I think that is extremely delicate, because I think this is the great review. Is digitalization a useful tool for workers' representatives? And I should ask Soraya and Fernando, what do they think about, is it good to have a Teams meeting with employees? Will more people come if we organize a Teams instead of going into the factory? Well, sometimes it's the only useful tool to gather people who are in very different places, but some others are not. Actually, the Spanish courts have already established, for example, that email is not a suitable tool for consultation tasks. It's useful and possible for information, but sending an email and receiving another email is against the spirit of the framework directive on information and consultation. So in our project, we have thought a little bit about what should we do with these digital tools, and our main proposal is to make compulsory in certain scenarios that the companies must provide the workers' representatives with hardware, with software, and with other tools, including secure platforms, to perform their role of representatives. And we are creating nothing, because in Spain at least, there is already the right to receive some equipment from the company, and all from a fax. But when was the last time you used a fax? No one. But that was considered. Now, okay, give them computers, give them cameras. This is a thing that must be thought about. And make digital tools the equivalent of physical tools. For example, signatures. Some legislations in the European Union, the 15 member states plus Turkey that we have studied, ask for a written signature. Okay? In our times, that's ridiculous. Create new tools for that. Of course, this is expensive. And we think, in the framework of this project, that public funding should help this transformation. We cannot put the burden of the digitalization of the representation on the shoulders of the companies, because in that case, the only thing that will happen will be resistance and negative to implementing that. Because we think at the end that this kind of digitalization is good for the company. It can bring a better cooperation between labor and management. People trained to use these resources can provide an excellent input, excellent insights of what's happening in the company. So our bet is, yes, digitalization can be positive. Of course, with all the caveats, with all the attention. For example, think about the new directive on the European Works Councils. One of the changes has been that the agreement establishing the Works Council must specify the format of the meeting. So that means that we can legally have virtual meetings and physical meetings. And if we check the works that led to the directive, we can see that Business Europe was extremely pro virtual meetings, but the European Trade Union Confederation was extremely against virtual meetings. Why? I think after 6 years of the pandemic, we have learned everything that must be learned about Team and Zoom meetings, and after 5 minutes you may talk, oh, another cat meeting, that's beautiful. The capacity of attention, the capacity of discussion, the possibility of reaching agreements, it's not the same when you're playing against the screen than when you are watching the other people's, the heat, the temperature, the clothing, all that creates the climate for the idea. But we must be very conscious that the digital tools are already in the courts. And I once again am going to quote the Spanish Tribunal Supremo. In 2023, there was a decision at the highest level about the substitution of email communications for workers' representatives by an app, the corporate app that was in every worker's telephone. They challenged it as an attack against freedom of association because the trade union argued that no one is going to check the app. It's not Spotify. I'm not going to open that app in order to find that info. Well, the Supreme Court supported the company's substitution and created a 3 points, once again, the 3 readers of Toronto, 3 points that must be passed in order to have this test of digital transformation. Using the app must not be more difficult than using the email. Second, the app should be more efficient. And third, data protection must be respected. So that's one of the great challenges of the future, how to integrate positively digital tools in the role of workers' representatives. Let's get into algorithms. Not the first novel that ever dealt with algorithms, but the most famous one, the one who put algorithms on the table, was Dune in the 60s by Frank Herbert. If you have read Dune, it's an excellent book about ecology, tyranny, trade, and algorithms. And in one moment of the past of the novel, they destroyed all the machines. That was called the Butlerian Jihad. We can discuss later who is Butler. And the first commandment is, you shall not make a machine in the likeness of a human being. And we are challenging that commandment. We are going to that black box who says strange things. Okay, so how should we deal with the algorithms? Well, let's look to it from the collective point of view. As you have seen this morning, we have had brilliant research from Teresa Coelho Moreira and also from Daniel Pérez del Prado on this issue, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. And there is also further research from Noelia de Torres Bóveda, who has just defended her superb thesis, where she has studied all related to information and consultation rights about algorithms. She has created such an excellent piece that I cannot say anything that you have not said, which would be stealing from you. Noelia has created a perfect list about the hypothetical right of consultation about the algorithm, which things should be told, which things should be heard, so you can ask her and not me in the debate later. The collective agreements about banking and chemical industry have already been mentioned this morning. I always like to stress the importance of the two branches, banks, chemical industry, the old good money, the money that has always been there since the Industrial Revolution, and banks from before. So if the great classic branches are already dealing with algorithms, that means that that's an important issue. What's needed here? Information. I don't know if you have ever seen an algorithm. I have one in my laptop because I asked a friend who is a computer engineer to prepare one for me to discuss it with my students. An algorithm is completely incomprehensible. So what's the value of giving, yes, take this code, read it? No. I think that following the platform or directive, a new rule should be included in the framework directive on information and consultation, in order to make the relevant size companies pay for experts in order to help workers' representatives to understand the working and the content of the algorithm. There are many other contents linked to these digital rights, and our book, Gabor Kartias, has prepared a next chapter also on health and safety, so you should be running to the bookshops in order to buy it. So what's our final point of view? We're considering the future that's opening in front of us. We think that social dialogue is still a tool of great interest for developing inclusive, transparent, and sustainable digitalization. It's not a one-sided thing. We need cooperation, we need collaboration to create something strong. The European Union must have a role of leadership and not let the member states create micro-legislations on this issue. And for this reason, we consider that a lot of European funding should be given to researchers in order to organize meetings like this one in order to think about that. If you are really interested about the results of our project, it's my pleasure to present the cover of the new book that will be in open access using digitalization in our favor. Thank you very much for your attention. It has been a true pleasure.
I think it's pretty difficult to speak after launch usually, but we have an excellent section so far. So we continue from right to strike, give a lot of information conductor rights is coming. So listen, Silvia Renone speak from ETY on collective bargaining, which is my favorite. You have a usual, like, he promised 18 minutes, and we will do 18 and a half. So you have something like 20 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will try. First, an apology. I'm not in my best shape today, so I am a bit more lightheaded and confused than normal. So you will apologize for that. I hope I can manage to deliver, I don't say meaningful, but understandable presentation. So many thanks to the speaker before me, because they really outlined, I would say, everything that is necessary to build the prerogative of collective bargaining, which is a fundamental right. And it's clear that collective bargaining is a fundamental right that should involve the regulation and governance of AI, and by the ILO fundamental conventions, and it's open to all workers. So this is the fulcrum, this is the frame of this presentation. Before going to AI, I would like to use the first maybe half, a bit less of the presentation to talk a bit about the digital economy and the digital firm. Basically addressing the same point, how technology is disrupting the application of norms, labor norms, but focusing more than on the technology here on the firm and on the company ecosystem that is allowed to exist because of the technology. And here is a bit of a sort of characterization of why digital firms are so disruptive when we talk about the application and effectiveness of labor rights, especially collective labor rights. First, digital firms. Well, they are being defined, especially when looking at the platform economy, digital labor platform, but also online marketplace, they have been defined by sociologists and economists and researchers in general as exerting a regulatory power. They have the power to influence and set the rule of the game for the provision of services and labor. So the market power has become so big that they influence our governance power more than traditional companies. Then there are, of course, global actors. This we all know, we have seen the transnational dimension, European level, but also there are global actors. We think, I should have said, that digital firms, we consider platforms, of course, but also those firms providing digital services, such as Google or OpenAI, but also digital marketplace, such as Amazon, and all other companies that act within the ecosystem of these companies. They're global actors, and this is a fact, of course, the way labor has become commodity again, more and more than ever, because it's quite easy to distribute the labor processes between the global north and global south. Despite that, and because of the strong reliance on fixturing and subcontracting, such companies are actually surprisingly slim and small when we look at the actual employed workforce. So this is quite an important aspect to consider for collective labor rights, and Elizabeth and Jose Maria very much highlighted is the disaggregation and fragmenting of workforce across places, and this is really one of the characteristics of digital firms. At the same time, I was thinking, what is the glue that keeps this firm together, beside an employment contract, beside all these more administrative traditional tools, is actually technology, and specifically data control, the ability of the principal control contractor within this ecosystem to capture, process, and monetize workers' extracted data. So basically, we have a situation where we have very powerful private actors that are using technology in order to exercise and protect the regulatory power. And also, this actor also exert influence, governance influence on contingent sector. A clear example would be Amazon, digital marketplace, we all know, that has a very strong regulatory, let's say, informal regulatory influence on logistics sector that are officially not part of, not always part of the company structure. So these are a bit of situation that we are looking a bit now helicopter view situation that well, explain or tie with the points together of situation I've been seeing more on practice. A parallel conversation is now reaching the policy-making level, not in a labor law, unfortunately. Dimension is the concept of monopsony power. Monopsony power is, for those who didn't yet heard this notion, is basically the is when an entity, when a person is the basically only buyer of a product. And here we are in a situation where we can imagine that person being an employer, being the only buyer of the product being labor. And in such a situation, the only buyer of labor has a very strong bargaining position in deciding the term condition, because those selling the product, labor, do not have any other appearance and do not have any other contractor. So this is a bit the situation that if we look at digital firm as able to control a very broad ecosystem of economic and contractor relations, not literally, but the same dynamic can be observed in the digital economy. And to show it better, I would like to point also at some certified as a valuable research causes of the monopsony power. And again, monopsony is this dynamic where you have one employer controlling and buying the labor of many workers, but also as a consequence, one controlling, dictating working conditions for many workers and having the possibility to push labor cost, wages down. And the literature, not labor law literature, but still, identifies certain causes for this pressure, downward pressure. And we can see that these causes are really much present also in the digital economy. One, I said, there is only one employer. A classical example was in the US or in the rural Britain, a mine, a coal mine. So that would be the only employer of a community would be able to set the wage pressure down. Now in the US would be Walmart, a huge retail shop buying all the labor. Studies have shown that in those situations, if you compare the same community, the same more or less prerogative and standards to different communities without such one employer, we see that wages are lower. So that's more or less the cause. And we do see that there are studies showing that in the digital economy, in online platform work, for instance, companies are able to put in place more or less the same dynamic to seclude workforce. Then another cause is that the company has a very dominant position in one sector, but also in contingent sector. This was the example I showed before about, for instance, Amazon. Then the example of non-compete clauses. This is a traditional economy. Many company asked workers to sign a clause saying that after the termination of employment contract, such worker will not be able to work for competitors in the same geographical area, for instance, on the same type of job. These sort of clauses obviously limit the freedom of the workers to look for better employment situation with better employer, and therefore they push the wage setting down. A lot of platforms, if you look really at terms and conditions, are starting to put these non-compete clauses, especially in the domestic sector, the care sector. Then finally, agreements that eliminate competition are also causes of this downward pressure on wages, and has been shown by the recent European Commission decision to fine a cartel, basically, well, an agreement between Delivery Hero and Glovo, that they decided not to hire each other workers. So they are so powerful, they control so well the market, there are so few actors, they can decide not to give workers better working conditions by giving them competition on the labor market. This to show that if we look a bit at this more like high, I would say macroeconomic, but they will laugh at me if I say so, reason of why we need stronger labor law, right? Because labor law normally has no reach to address such issues. And here we have indeed sort of like mismatch that is more and more obvious of the capacity of labor law in terms of personal scope, but also material scope, to address such an imbalance of power and allocating accountabilities at the correct level. The example is a company exercising downward wage pressure on contingent sector. How, if you are a trade union representing worker in logistics, and this logistic company working directly for Amazon, you should be able to reach Amazon regulated. So this is, we all know this, we were saying, but the causes are multifaceted and the problem is quite broad. Okay, I think I used more or less half of my time to give this introduction. And now the idea was to try to tie a bit these principles, these challenges, to think how can we propose a new normative paradigm, and here we are going a bit in utopian talks because the reality is so much like behind, to make sure that at least collective rights, that is the field on which I'm looking at, can somehow realign their effectiveness to the actual actor involved in these dynamics. And now to do so, well, my proposal is to look at the expression of this excessive market power that companies are exerting, and because it's when we have those expressions that we need the most a countervailing action. And how do we identify such expression? Well, it's interesting to look at situations where companies are able to extract value from labor processes through technology. This could be one of the lenses. Who is benefit from AI, basically? Who is benefit from the use of technology in labor process, and see if such extraction of value is compensated by traditional labor rights. Normally it isn't. So here is a bit my attempt to classify, to propose a different classification of AI technology through these lenses of expropriation of workers' value, we can say, or empowerment dynamic. And this is just a proposal, of course, but we can, for instance, assume that algorithmic management or other HR support software, they act very well, they provide the capacity for the company or the employer, really, to extract value from workers who are more controlled, surveilled, and the labor is more effective. But such extraction of power, of value, is not compensated. That's clear in the sense we still don't have mechanisms to redistribute productivity on a structural basis. You may have bonuses, but then we have other AI tools that can be used instead more to realize a win-win. I would say like software such as ChatGPT that make the worker more effective, or software that aid graphic design used by the workers. The workers may be happy to use them. And the employer, the direct employer as well, because you have more effective workers. On the long term, however, studies suggest that workers become more an administrative assistant of the technology than an actual agent to it. So they become deprofessionalized and they lose skills. So here as well, in the long term, workers lose value, and such value loss is not compensated at the moment. Then we have the most critical one, the most dystopic one, I think, which is AI tools that there are. Basically, if the previous type was augmenting work capabilities, here we have AI tools that are substituting work capability. The two types are very much one is a development of the other, I would say, and they are very much used in the creative sector and media sector. For instance, for actors, no? They are a lot of companies, they are creating, they have the technology to create the synthetic actors or voice actor interpretation and so forth. In this case, we have again a value expropriation from the worker to maybe the company formally employing them or their contractor, but also this expropriation goes beyond the linear relationship to profit the businesses that are developing AI, and they're making AI probably a substitute of workers. So you see this expropriation goes very far, and there are basically no tool in labor law to address that. What are the available tools in labor law? I just mentioned them. Information and consultation right, we extensively covered them. Collective bargaining, that's a right, fundamental right. And then we have in the EU level social dialogue mechanisms, so regulatory codetermination when we look at the EU labor law, meaning that social partners, trade unions and management are consulted and in a way participate in the lawmaking process. And it's very important because such presence, such consultation is able to provide a stronger social dimension to the eventual regulation. What are the limits of these forums? So we saw very well information, especially this morning, information and consultation as they are structured now in traditional EU acquis, but also the AI Act or the Platform Work Directive. They are mostly related to transparency right, the right of workers to understand. Okay, there is not yet this value extraction recompensation. They understand how the algorithm really works, but they do not understand how this value is then reconverted in capital. So the traditional thing that we unions were understanding and intervening in, now they're fully obscure. And also there is no formal involvement of the technology producer. Does not always have to be, but there are no ways to reach that entity. Then collective bargaining. We are conducting an AQI study done is involved in a brilliant chapter on collective bargaining AI in Spain. So we're collecting with data on is collective bargaining, traditional unions, are they managing to regulate and probably and perhaps countervail this value extraction? And the answer is very rarely. Majority of time, such collective bargaining agreement, they restate the legislation, they restate transparency right, but they do not intervene, adding mechanisms to substantially preserve workers' rights in terms of wage, minimum working time, collective dismissal, and so forth. And here as well, it's very difficult for this agreement to reach the actual controller of the technology, so they are not involved and they are not obliged to shape the technology accordingly. Then, what about social dialogue? Well, social dialogue, we saw that the EQCs, the European Union Confederation, has been involved in the Platform Work Directive, and honestly, I work a bit in contact with them, that has given some results. Not because of the structure of the competence of the EU, social partners are not involved in internal market regulation. So on the AI Act, they were not consulted, and this probably is reflected to an extent. The same is the machinery regulation, that is very relevant for health and safety in AI. The same is with the copyright directive that could be mobilized and revised and mobilized to compensate for value extracted in AI creative sector, and the AI Act, of course, I mentioned. So what is, this is going to probably be my last slide, what is one of the possible proposals to re-articulate collective labor rights? I just put there a proposal, you don't really need to look at it, it's just to try to internalize the gaps and weaknesses of existing framework and try to understand the limit of this framework in actually rebalancing this extraction, this augmented extraction of value powered by technology. So if we look at the system of algorithm management, of course, information and consultation, they should look at transparency, but should also explain how data are incrementing productivity for the worker, for the company, so that worker representative can use this information. Collective bargaining in algorithm management, regulating algorithm management tool, they should start also talking about wages in relation to the use of technology and the distribution of productivity gain and so forth. If we look at the other software used for enhancing augmenting your capability, transparency is very important, but it's also very important to enhance skills and make workers participating in the process of automation because they make them less redundant. So basically try to understand how to close the gaps. Finally, when we look at those AI systems that are very much likely substituting professions, here it's very important to act on a regulatory level to create prohibition and limits and to involve worker representatives in such limits. So the end of the story is that information consultation very important, transparency and data protection rights very important, but unless we are talking of a very specifically very strong collective rights system, like there are very few in the world or in Europe, they are not able to alone trigger such reverse of value distribution. So if we look at, this is the concluding slide, if we look at what lies ahead, what are the future reforms we may want to follow, well, or actually propose because they're not in the pipeline, one would be to pretty much, I hope the unions start putting more pressure on the need to reform the scope of institutional social dialogue, meaning official social partners should be involved in the process of lawmaking concerning also internal market regulation when they have a very strong impact on the way labor processes are folding. Then a proposal that actually was very much inspired by the work of Elizabeth and Jose Miranda on the idea of perhaps having a progressive omnibus, not just a regulatory omnibus, try to harmonize existing information consultation and adding a more substantive, redistributive tone. Ensure, as a third option, also a third proposal, ensure that the accountability of employer obligation are actually allocated where is meaningful, so that in these collective rights, the counterpart is actually an agent and can determine the way technology is impacting the world of work. Then there is much to do also for the trade unions themselves. Working closely with them, I see there is a lot of gaps, a lot of need of better transnational fertilization. Yeah, so finally, what the point is, this empowerment dynamic, I hope, and I think is really needed, that it will more structurally enter the normative framework of labor law. Otherwise, the risk is really to have a shrinking labor law, and we know the consequence. So thank you very much.
In the early 1990s, I'm sorry for boring you with my details of my life, but the early 1990s, I took part in moderation training programs. Later on, I learned to know that it was by the evil Soros Foundation. But at that time, I learned that it's a good idea to give back a little bit the floor to speakers if they want to reflect each other's speech, very briefly to keep time for questions. So if you want to reflect, Tonya?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
I'll be happy to. I wanted to say briefly, just to make this clear, I am a great fan of the right to strike. It is a background threat, but not actual strikes. Ideally, you would not get to that point. So what you want is information and consultation. You want the collective bargaining, you want the social dialogue, but the right to strike is the background threat, which is useful when that falls apart. And that's why I wanted to advocate that. So I just wanted to make that first point clear, because I came first rather than last. But secondly, I just wanted to say something briefly about the transnational aspect of platform work, but also algorithmic management, AI, and these digital firms, which has been pointed to by Elizabeth and Sylvia, and Gemma, of course. But I just wanted to say that it is really time now, I think, within the EU but internationally, to revisit the norms relating to not just sympathy and secondary action, as I was saying earlier, regarding a third-party provider of black box, the algorithm, but also to seriously think about coordinating action and making that lawful. So at the ILO, there are very limited protections through the supervisory bodies relating to secondary and sympathetic action. There's very little on transnational entitlements to strike, and I think that's becoming a live issue. So I'm going to just end this brief reply by flagging two other open access publications that you might want to look at. The first is a special issue of the Comparative Labour Law and Policy Journal, which is on rethinking the right to strike, and has a brilliant piece in it by Judy Fudge and Hila Shamir, which looks at the Amazon cross-border industrial action in Europe and makes the case for transnational industrial action. So 2025, Comparative Labour Law and Policy Journal. The other is that Judy and Jeffrey Boat and I have just brought out a co-edited, internationally co-written book on the right to strike reimagined, which again makes those arguments about transnational industrial action and the capacity to protect a right to strike. Not that we want a lot of strikes, but we just want that bargaining power. Thanks.
And you can download the book on right to strike, open access.
It's open
free.
access on Heart. Yeah.
And it was circulated, the information was circulated in the access through the other and newsletter last week. More reflections? Would you like to add something? You don't have to. I'm just offering.
Just very briefly, perhaps 2 points. I think it is very important, and thank you so much, Celia, for doing so, for remarking that if EU law continues, if EU legislator, and that's the member states, right? If the member states, as the EU legislator, continue to base employment legislation not on Article 153, then social partners are out of the game. And I think this combines quite nicely with the fragmentation that you referred to, Thomas. It's good that on the one hand, that what Jose Maria advocated for, the rules should cover everyone working side by side. The question then is, can we base those rules if we now legislate on that at EU level, if we do not base them on Article 153? Does this then lead to the fact that social partners are kept outside the picture? We cannot solve this here in academia, but this would need to lead to reform of the treaties, which of course is never going, unfortunately, it's not going to happen, but we need to think of it when advocating for it. Also, I take myself, right, Article 81 for our beautiful idea of this regulation on conflict of law rules. Well, also their social partners would not be involved in the legislative process. So this is the caveats that we also have to think about ourselves, and I take myself by the nose. And the second one, fragmentation. That's the issue with information and consultation rights. We have to be aware of the fact that in many member states, this is only the first and second step, then leading to participation, meaning co-determination. So as soon as we have a reference framework, a 28 legal framework, or whatever you call it, for information and consultation in those member states where co-determination is based on that, we also need to think of that when designing those rules or when addressing that, because it does not help the company if you have one legal regime for information and consultation and then another one completely separated for co-determination. And I think that is what, unfortunately, if it sees the light of day, would happen with the EU Inc. proposal, which from that point of view is a complete fail, unfortunately.
Very briefly, I would just like to comment on the functional interpretation of the scope of Title 10 in our policy paper. We advocate for an extension of the consultation of 154 to anything that's related to the labor market. Indeed, the Pact for European Social Dialogue of 2025 also wants to do this, and we also point out several examples of consultation taking place out of Title 10, for example, or the directive on amending the posting of workers directive. That's not a labor law directive, but a freedom of services, Articles 53 and 62. I will send you later my paper on this boring issue. But we think that there is a trend to expand the borders of consultation under this article.
If I
Yeah.
just to react on this, actually this is very, I didn't know about the posting, but I also noticed now the European Commission is revising guideline for mergers. So we are talking about competition law, totally different. And the idea was to add reflection on what if a merger is competitive, is creating an so basically is a merger legal or not? And the answer is depends on the anti-competitive effect it will create on the internal market. And in order to identify anti-competitive effect, now the Commission wants to look at the creation, following a merger, of a labor market monopoly. So when they had this idea following US competition authority, antitrust authority, they are also involved in the union. So they are informally, purely informally, involved and the EU level. So there are all these stakeholder meetings, etc., etc. So we do see it, but the point is not always and should be expanded. I fully agree.
Thank you so much. We still have 23 minutes, so plenty of space and time for comments, questions. Who's first?
Madre mía, esto es muy intenso.
Very nice to be first. Or you can be second. Any questions? Comments? When is the session over? 5 o'clock. No questions so far? Yeah, Giovanni Gaudio.
Venga, que nada nos vuelvan a dar de comer.
Ivan, can you just pass the mic? Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your presentations. A question, maybe directly, immediately to Silvia, but you don't know, because I think that
It's okay, but
the message that you are having from your presentation is that we have to reassess the scope of the legislation in order to reach the purposes of the legislation where the power is not located anymore into the employment relationship. But in a way, we're still talking about the employment relationship, looking at the contractual parties of the employment relationships, especially to the employer. Silvia mentioned that, for instance, competition law as concepts that are way more flexible than contractual concept that we have historically used to frame the employment relationship. So my question is, do we still need to talk about the parties of the employment relationships, especially on the employer side, calling them employers, or maybe it's simpler to forget the concept of the employer in this respect and start from the premise that maybe using this contractual concept is only creating problems because we are still looking at the contracts, and maybe we have to borrow from somewhere else, for instance, the competition law concept, other concepts that are closer to the concept of the firm in order to reassess the employment law legislation scope closer to other concepts that are not strictly related to the contractual concepts of the employment relationship. Thanks.
Thank you, Giovanni. Very good question. Yeah, that is indeed the point, the intention. Not try to understand who are the actors in the labor relationship. There was a lot talked about the scope of workers. Now I think you were one of the first to analyze the notion of employer. If we assume we still need a notion of employer, these are we don't know, but I think there is, first of all, it's necessary to make sure that when someone is designated contractually as employer, that's even just for labor law standards true. So if we see now quite interesting jurisprudence of the platform economy coming from Spain. I think it's mostly related last mile delivery from Amazon and Amazon Flex. sort of platform where Amazon is using intermediaries, and workers have been trying to claim before judicial authority they are in fact not self-employed but the employee, and they brought both the intermediary and Amazon, so the controller of the app, before the judge, and the judge noticed that the intermediary has no whatsoever functional autonomy. So here we are talking, just for really labor law purposes, about an employer who is not a contractual employer needs to be requalified. So that's very important to look at the autonomy of the actors. If an employer, contractual employer is not really autonomous towards another enterprise, then probably that enterprise is a real labor law employer. But then it's also important, I think, to go a bit beyond the paradigm of control and direction, but also start looking at which entity exercise economic and bargaining power on a given labor market. In order to do that, the competition law is an interesting tool because they're very pragmatic. So they start looking, when they look at undertaking, they look at economic unit. It's not just that company, but if that company has a subsidiary, they also look at the subsidiary, and if the subsidiary has economic dependency with another company, also that other company is included. So they look more pragmatically at markets more than at actors. So it could be interesting to start looking at economic unity, but what is the connective, that's a bit used out of context, but what is the connecting factor here? Well, Bale, that is the author of Fishering, has suggested, looking at the technology, to use the ownership and control of algorithm management tools or AI tools as the connective factor. So perhaps looking at who is extracting value, who is controlling and benefit from the technology could be an interesting starting point. But it's really a sociological dimension, which is very interesting for us.
I was just going to say that in relation to collective bargaining, to the extent that that's a fundamental right and recognised as such under Article 3 of Convention 193, there really shouldn't be an issue around employment status. So the conservatism in Article 9 shouldn't be relevant. It's only really relevant, as far as I can tell, on remuneration under the ILO Convention. I think that there is also a real possibility here if we did recognise the capacity for secondary action, even if in a limited way, responding to what we're now finding the competition authorities seeing as appropriate, and recognising forms of monopsony and other forms of control, then again you would have some right to strike as bargaining power behind collective bargaining in that context, and it would be entirely appropriate to do so.
It's just kind of further food for thought. Having done quite some research now on kind of the information consultation conundrum, would the question, the proper question be who exercises employer functions? Think of temporary agency work. So there's the agency and then the user company. In several member states, kind of the employer function can be split. Also depending on kind of the function of individual labor law and collective labor law. So for sure, also during the time the employee works in the user company, the contractual employer is still the temporary agency, right? But kind of if we think then of collective labor law issues, or the information and consultation at the establishment, if such a thing like establishment exists, or in France this communauté de travail, right? It might be that for the time the employee works with the user undertaking, this employee is part of that communauté, right? And therefore, the employer, the head of this, the vis-a-vis, right, is the responsible one, has the employer function as regards those rights, information consultation rights. So I think it would be rather the question of who exercises employer functions, and that can be split. And we see that already happening in the member states at national level, for example, temporary agency work.
More questions? No more questions. we have a lot of coffee waiting for you, but before we go, the speakers didn't let you sleep. Thank all of them for that. So let's make some noise for them.
So we could have even spoken longer. We wouldn't have need to hurry that much.
Too much.
Actually, we should tell you earlier, so
Entre el inglés y el tema,
Sí, porque yo pensaba que el español iba a hablar
Claro.
español, por lo menos, digo, uno de cinco.
me ha escrito Fernando Mojar, que está esta mañana,
Sí.
me dice, esta me interesa mucho, hazme un resumen. Madre
Hostia.
mía, pero si no me he enterado de la mitad.
Bueno, de todas formas,